don't need this really. Welcome. Welcome to Union Theological Seminary. For those of you who are not familiar with this place, this has traditionally been an ecumenical Christian community back 182, 83 years now, and has for a long time had a very strong social justice leaning to it, and recently that ecumenical tradition has expanded into an interreligious one. So there is now there's a program here, Masters of Divinity in Islam, and there's a Masters of Divinity in Buddhism. And associated with that Masters of Divinity in Buddhism is the Thich Nhat Hanh program for engaged Buddhism. And for those of you who may wonder why Thich Nhat Hanh, it's because when he was at Columbia in 62, 63, this was the religion department for Columbia. And so when he earned his religion degree, he actually earned that degree from Union Theological Seminary, so we claim him as an alum. So and he's actually in the database as an alum from here. That was discovered by accident when we were doing something else entirely. But, so it was kind of a big thing. So we contacted his community and developed this relationship and started talking about what it was to think about programming, publicly facing programming that dealt with the intersection between both Buddhism and social action or social engagement, and tied into the social justice programming here. So that's what we are doing in part with this wonderful series that Peace Twesaji organized. I can claim no credit for this. This is all Peace's work. I just stand up here and talk. And actually, I don't think I introduced myself. I'm Greg Snyder, and I'm the Senior Director and Assistant Professor of Buddhist Studies here. And Peace is the Program Manager for the Buddhist Studies here at Union. And so we're kind of the Buddhist Studies department, the two of us. And so I just want to welcome you, and I also want to welcome Shugen. Thank you, Shugen Roshi, for being here tonight. This series that came out of a discussion that Peace and I had about just talking about the situation of social justice and social action in the world, and what shunyata or non-dual traditions might have to offer thinking about what it is to act in the world in ways that are not harmful or destructive when you are addressing systemic oppression and other issues. So it came out of that conversation, and Peace put together this wonderful lineup of teachers that have been coming and talking on that, and so far it has been great. Shugen is the abbot, for those of you who don't know, is within the Mountains and Rivers Order, and is the abbot of the Zen Mountain Monastery and the Fire Lotus Temple in Brooklyn. A dear friend. Thank you for agreeing to be here, and thank you for all of your generosity and kindness and time over the years in discussing what it is. There aren't that many people who are teachers at the heads of Zen communities, so I have sought much guidance from Shugen, and have been very grateful for his support. We look forward to, is there anything that you want to say? You can say whatever you'd like to say about yourself, but I'll cut it there, and welcome for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. So, and that has gone both ways.
Yeah.
So I really didn't know what this was going to be, and I decided not to ask. And so I was sort of decided I would be prepared for anything. I didn't know. Anyway, so what I thought I would do, because it's such a large subject in a way, and could be taken up in so many different directions, and I was looking at the list of speakers that you got lined up, and can only imagine the many different directions that this series is going to go. So what I thought I would do is, because I was asked to submit a topic a long time ago, years it seems, which often happens, and then I start thinking about what I'm actually going to do. So I had said that I would draw from the Vimalakirti Sutra, which I will do, And I thought that would be good because it's such an excellent sutra. It plays such an important role in the Mahayana tradition, Tibetan Buddhism. And I thought it specifically addresses this subject in its own time and in its own language. And so what I thought I'd do is just speak for a little bit in terms of the Dharma, my understanding of the Dharma in relationship to this question of emptiness and social action, and really, if we think of that as compassion, genuinely, like actually living out our bodhisattva vow in this world, in this time. What do these teachings teach us? And how can they help us to not just survive, but to thrive? And so what I want to do is just work from a short passage of the Vimalakirti Sutra. For those of you who may not be familiar, this is a sutra in which Vimalakirti is a non-historical person, but was said to be a lay adept at the time of the Buddha, whose enlightenment was virtually equal to the Buddha. And he is sick. And so the Buddha asks his various disciples to go and pay a sick call to the Vimalakirti, and they all beg out because each of them recounts an encounter they had with Vimalakirti where he basically taught them the Dharma in such a way that they realized how little they knew. And so they were not eager to go and meet with him again. But finally, Manjushri says that he will go, and so then everybody goes, because they all want a piece of the action. And so they go into Vimalakirti's hut, which is a tiny, tiny, tiny little space, and as is true with Mahayana sutras, in which all things are possible, thousands and thousands of people and deities and devas all fit into this room perfectly. And so Vimalakirti says that he is sick with the illness of all sentient beings. He's sick because all sentient beings are suffering. That's his illness. And so then the sutra unfolds as they sort of take that up. And so in this passage, and this is from the Goddess chapter, for those of you who are familiar, Manjushri, who is the bodhisattva wisdom of Buddhism, asks the Buddha, if a bodhisattva realizes the ultimate selflessness of all beings, how do they generate the great love and compassion towards them? And this is such an important question. It's really an ancient question. I mean, we're addressing this as we are in our time because we must and should, but also in a sense because we can. We can in a way that perhaps generations before us couldn't because of the structures in which they survived, which is patronage and surviving through donations, and you don't want to upset your donors, and other reasons perhaps. But in our time, I feel like this is our time, actually. The time of Buddhism has come to really engage this, and in a sense, as perhaps every generation's responsibility is, like with children, their responsibility in a sense is to take what they've learned from their parents and move it a step forward. And so in each generation of Buddhists, I think of that as our charge, is to sort of move it forward in terms of continuing to fulfill or more fulfill the teachings. And so this tension between, which is a necessary tension, between selflessness and the world of things and phenomena, between turning inward in the practice of meditation, which is so essential to so many of us as Buddhists, and is really the pathway to realizing selflessness, and turning outward and responding to the cries of the world. Speaking and silence, the one and the many. So all of these dualities are not just the sources of suffering, but they're actually our pathways to fulfilling our vows, because to realize liberation is to realize the non-duality. And so, in a sense, I feel like our time has given us the full fruition of the mandate. because there's no time to lose. And so Manjushri asked this question, how, if we realize selflessness, that all things are empty, then how do you generate love and compassion if you realize that love itself is empty? Compassion itself is empty. Suffering is empty. Empty of any inherent existence on its own. And so, and the reason this is so important is, as is often stated in the sutras in so many different ways, that the Dharma, anything that's powerful, also has the power to be dangerous. Right? Like electricity, right? It can toast your bread or it can kill you. And how do we handle it? And so the metaphor of the snake, that if you don't know how to pick up a poisonous snake and you pick it up wrongly, you could die. And so if we don't understand how we're picking up the Dharma, how we're understanding it, it can actually serve a counter purpose or work against its actual purpose. And so that means we have to really understand what emptiness is. And so in the tradition, there's understanding that conceptually, and there's understanding that experientially, and both of those work together in a very necessary way. I mean, to realize emptiness itself means realization of emptiness has to come into our cognitive mind. But how do you have cognition of something that is beyond experience? Right? This is why experiencing realization is so challenging, is because it's not something we can just decide to do. And so if we misunderstand it, if we misunderstand emptiness as Nagarjuna said, inherently non-existent, that nothing exists at all in any form, a kind of nihilist view, then we're in very dangerous waters, because that could lead to apathy, to indifference, to just denial of suffering, of people's actual experiences, which means it's also being denied within ourselves. And so that's why Nagarjuna's teaching in the Middle Way School was so important, because he taught that there isn't inherent existence, but neither is there inherent non-existence. That the Middle Way is free of both of those dualities. In the Zen tradition, traditional training, the way I think of it, is intended to take us, usher us, guide us through this process of gaining understanding, both conceptually and experientially, of the totality of, as John Kabat-Zinn called it, the whole catastrophe. Right? So that we begin in samsara, deeply embedded in the world of things and thingness. Things seem autonomous and existing on their own. They have their own power, whether it's an event or a situation or a system, or whether it's my mind, my emotions, my thoughts, and they're happening to us. And so we begin to examine that and see through that, and ultimately realize that there is no inherent anything, including emptiness itself, including Buddha Dharma. And then to move that forward into phenomena. And so one of the very important parts of Mahayana Buddhism is realizing the selflessness of self and other, person and phenomena, the whole world. And so in the Zen tradition, one of the ways the training and the teachings sort of takes us through this is a teaching called Master Dongshan's 5 ranks. He was a Chinese master. And the first two ranks are realizing absolute emptiness, and then realizing that as one's self and others. And then the third rank, which is where I want to pick up, is called coming from within the real. So in training, and in practice, this is the first step where we begin to move forward with that experience and understanding of emptiness into the world. And the poem associated with this says, within emptiness there is a path leading away from the dusts of the world. And we should understand, I understand that as leading away from our misunderstanding of the dusts of the world and seeing them as inherently obstructive. Because the thing about not having clear understanding is that we do have an understanding that we're functioning under. It's just not in accord with reality. So we're always functioning under some understanding. And so to have right understanding, the first of the Eightfold Path, is to begin to clarify that and bring that into alignment with the way things actually are. And so having realized self and others' emptiness, this teaching of Master Dongshan is now, how do you bring that forward? Coming from within the real. And so Vimalakirti responds to Manjushri's question, how do you generate the great love and compassion? And the important thing here is to understand how real this question is, and how both in past and present times there have been scholars and practitioners and aficionados of Buddhism and teachers who have misunderstood this and misused this to harm people. You know, we might think that it seems far-reaching to think that somebody would actually grasp at the idea of emptiness as in a kind of a nihilist view and actually believe in that and act upon that. But that's the reason it's been such a strong current within Buddhist teaching since the time of the Buddha, is because of the tendency towards that. You know, in a sense, the Buddhist psychologist who coined the term spiritual bypassing, I mean, this is the ultimate spiritual bypassing, right? Nothing matters anymore. Which Buddhism has never taught, just so we're clear on that. So Vimalakirti says the Bodhisattva should reflect thus. So this is how we generate great love and compassion. So this is how one should reflect. Just as I have realized the Dharma, so should I teach other beings. Thus, we generate the love that is truly a refuge for all living beings. And so the way I read this is that just as I have examined my own mind, confronted and met my own highs and lows, my obstacles, my suffering, my oppressor, my racist, my tyrant, as well as my liberator, as I have met all of those beings within my mind and within myself and through my actions, I am studying the mind of all human beings, all sentient beings, because there's one mind. I'm studying it through my particular karma. But even that notion of karma being particular, right, is something that we really need to examine, because how many of our thoughts actually originated with us? How many of our emotions began within ourselves? Could we even begin to parse that out? And so sometimes there's talk of collective karma, the karma of our families, our peers, our groups, our identities, our nation, our society, and so on. But recently I've been thinking about this more as collaborative karma, because it's much more of a collaborative effort. And that has profound implications. So it's personal in the sense that it's my mind, my thoughts, my actions, my karma. And so I need to take responsibility for that, because I am the actor. But it's collaborative in the sense that I am a part of structures and systems, small and large, that have all had a hand in this. And so in that way, it's also not personal. My teacher used to say that without enlightenment, compassion is not ultimate compassion. Without compassion, enlightenment is not true enlightenment. That they also are non-dual. And which means that at every step along the way in our practice, we need to be ensured that we're cultivating. You know, the Buddha said that the path is fundamentally about the Shila, about a morality of precepts, which we could think of as compassion action. Samadhi, calming the mind, and insight, prajna. And so if we think that whenever we're thinking of ourselves as practitioners or we are practicing, that means those three elements should be present. or at least nearby. Because there are some practices that appear to focus on one aspect or another. And so that in practicing, if we're not cultivating compassion, then we're not really cultivating an enlightened mind. And in generating compassion and really being active in the world, if we're not developing our clarity and our understanding, then our compassion is to some degree going to be limited. And so how do we live this? So Vimalakirti said, this love, this compassion, and in his footnote in this translation by Robert Thurman, which is the text I was using, he has a footnote where he explains his use of the word love. And this has been translated some years ago. But for many years, love was not used a lot in Buddhist language. And he talks about how he thinks a lot of teachers and scholars were hesitant to do that because it had so much association, so many associations in terms of Western sort of culture, but also religious usage. And he says, but it is love. He says, it's selfless love. And so when we think of compassion in Buddhism, it is love. And it's a love that can be filled with and generated by warmth, right? Which is the love that we love and the love that we recognize. But it's also not limited by that. Right? It's not limited by feeling. It can be raised up or motivated or strengthened by feeling, but it's not limited by feeling. That's very important. Because feelings come and go. They're impermanent. And so Vimalakirti said this love that he speaks of, that we are cultivating, is peaceful because it's free of grasping. And that whenever we're grasping, there's anxiety, there's nervousness, there's fear. Why else would we grasp? Why else would we deny? Why else would we cling? And so he says that anxiety is dropped away or is dropping away. And so it's becoming, that love is peaceful. One of the things that the Buddha talked about was how one of the things that we can give, as giving is one of the important practices, is to give fearlessness. Which is such a wonderful thing to reflect on. How do you give fearlessness? And so when love is peaceful, that's giving fearlessness. He says it's not feverish because it's free of the passions. And in Buddhism, passion here is not the passion of wholeheartedness, commitment, of dedication. Rather, it's being sort of at the mercy and not understanding the ups and downs of our inner world, our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, our desires. So it's not feverish. And again, this is one of the challenges and why wisdom and compassion is so important as a non-dual reality, because wisdom alone, in a sense, has no legs. It has no arms. It has no warmth. And so compassion is the warmth, is the activity. But it's not feverish in the sense that it's entangled. He said it accords with reality. This, again, we're still talking about love and compassion. It accords with reality because it's equanimous in all three times. And so it's clearly, it's immediately present, immediately responsive, but not reactive. Right? And again, this is where not depending on feelings is important. Using feelings and emotions and whatever is useful is a very important part of practice in Mahayana teaching, but not being dependent. He said it's non-dual because it's involved neither with the external nor the internal. So here again, we might think of this, well, in many ways we might think of this, but one way is that these sort of tensions that I spoke about, which I'd say is healthy tensions, necessary tensions, right? Between these apparent dualities, but they're really just two aspects of one thing. And so to be neither involved, which means to not be entangled in one side or another, but actually to be cultivating a non-dual, which means complete, unified, boundless, boundarylessness. And then finally he said it's imperturbable because it's totally ultimate. And I think of this as the Dharma being uncorruptible. People can be corrupted, institutions can be corrupted. In other words, we can lose our way. But the Dharma never loses its way, because it's not a thing. Right? It has no agenda, it has no consciousness, it has no body. It doesn't need anything. And so it's imperturbable. And I think of this as also as having that quality of fearlessness, courage. You know, it's so interesting to me when we see something appearing in the teachings, particularly when they go back all the way to the beginning. Why are these teachers speaking about this? Because people need to hear it, right? So when the Buddha talked about fear, there's a sutra when he talked about fear and dread. Why is he telling us this story? Because we have fear and dread, right? We need to know, what do we do when we have fear? And so in the Prajnaparamita Sutras, when the Buddha says, if we turn towards truth, what is real, and we don't turn and run away, I'm paraphrasing, if we don't turn and run away, then we may be ready to encounter the teachings, the practice, the path. Acknowledging that we might turn and run away. Because facing what is true and real is hard. Right? If we haven't seen that, we may not be practicing yet. Why else would we put so much of our vital energies in our culture into doing exactly not that? And so to be imperturbable. And you know, one of the things to hold in mind, I think, when we study these sutras, is often the sutras are speaking from an enlightened perspective and sort of from an absolute embodiment, right? So to be completely free of grasping and peaceful, to be free, you know, of attachment to the passions, to be, you know, completely equanimous. And we can read that and think, well, that's not me. But we need, the way I understand it, is I think of this as it's both speaking about a completely fulfilled path. It's also trying to rouse our aspiration. And it's trying to provide us with an example that is larger than where we are. Because we have such an inclination towards complacency and self-satisfaction. But not, I don't see its intention to discourage us or make us feel like, well, I'm not there, so I guess this is not for me. So when we read these presentations of a sort of a fully embodied Buddha or Bodhisattva, we understand implicit within that is the path of that very virtue, practicing it at every step along the way, which means our patience and our resilience, our stamina, our confidence, and it means those qualities when we are not confident, when we are not peaceful, when we are retreating, when we are fearful. I mean, those moments are some of the most important moments for practitioners. And it's easy to say that. I remember listening to my teacher to say that, and I was like, yeah, I can't wait. Right? And then when it was happening, one, I didn't recognize that was happening. I just thought, this just sucks, right? And I wish it would stop. And two, I didn't see it as a moment of practice. I just saw it as something that was wrong. So there's a difference, again, there's concept and there's conception and there's experience. But it's so important because it helps us to shed our ideas of what these virtues mean. So when we're angry and we're practicing the anger, even if it's just with a couple of nails hanging onto a cliff, that's what compassion looks like in that moment for that person. It doesn't feel like compassion, probably. To somebody else, it may not look like compassion because they can't see into the insides of that person, but that's what compassion, how it manifests. And so all of these qualities are the path itself. They are continually unfolding. And I think that particularly in bodhisattva practice and meeting the suffering of the world, which is so much larger than ourselves. That's so important because it's just so easy to be defeated and to feel impotent. And for so many apparently valid reasons. And so but that mentality of there's a problem, we have to fix it, is part of the deluded mind. And so when we get caught in that mind, we get frozen pretty quickly, or some version of something that doesn't work very well. But when we keep coming back to the sense of this is a path, right? We might be able to point to a beginning, but we can't point to an end. We can have confidence in what we do in this moment because we are studying karma and we understand how that works. And so that means we don't have to get hung up on the details, although the details are important too. Because we are actually trying to affect change. Right? We're not just playing at this. Because the stakes are high, lives are on the line. But at the same time, we don't get crippled and paralyzed by that process to goal mentality, succeeding and failing mentality. Bodhidharma is considered the first ancestor of the Zen tradition. An Indian master went to China. And one of the things he taught was that when you meet adversity, don't be surprised, because it makes sense. And I've always really liked that and brought that to mind in certain moments, because it's really a challenge, I think, or an invitation to study how things work and to study causation, which is not just a theoretical thing. It's actually showing us and revealing to us everything. Everything that's happening inside of us and around us. And it doesn't tell us what to do. It doesn't explain things away, but it helps us to not be so surprised in a certain sense. It doesn't mean the pain, it doesn't, in a sense, lessen the pain, but it does help us to understand how things are working, and if we want to be working within those things, that's pretty important. When you meet adversity, don't be surprised. It makes sense. And again, I think this is where understanding karma is both personal and collaborative, small and large. And so then Manjushri says to Vimalakirti, well, how should I apply myself if I want to free myself? And Vimalakirti says, apply yourself appropriately. What more is there to say? So what does that mean? Manjushri wants to know. He says, what does that mean? And Vimalakirti says, apply yourself to not producing and not destroying. And so now he's speaking from that ground of emptiness. To not bring into existence something that in our mind exists apart and independent of everything else, or anything else. And to not destroy anything as though something exists autonomously and can be destroyed. In other words, don't use your mind to create boundaries that create suffering. Manjushri says, well, what do I not produce? What do I not destroy? And Vimalakirti now, I think, is very kind and, in a sense, indulgent and truthful. He says, don't produce evil and don't destroy good. Very simple. Cease from harm. Do all that is good. Study and realize your mind. And so in Dongshan's 5 ranks, he says the next step is arriving at mutual integration. So this is the profound nature of the Mahayana, of Nagarjuna's teaching, that there is nothing to deny. In what we would deny, there is nothing in that to deny. And there is nothing to affirm. In what we would affirm, there is nothing in it inherently to affirm. And that union, that mutual integration is this. So the question of how can we move forward within selflessness of self and other, all we have to do is look around. It's happening all the time. Why then isn't it happening more in accord with loving kindness and compassion? Because we don't see. And not seeing it, what we do see is real, and what we don't see is not real. The poem to that says, when two blades cross points, don't withdraw. When two things that appear to be in conflict, appear to be opposed, don't withdraw. He said, rather become like a master of the sword and bloom like a lotus in the fire. Which is an image that's used. The lotus is a symbol of enlightenment, and it grows in murky, muddy, cloudy water. But this incredible blossom, perfect. And blooming within the fire is within the fire of samsara. It's within the fire of the house that's burning. I remember years ago when we started the Fire Lotus Temple down on 23rd Street, Dr. Roshi got an image of Aidosonten Fudo, with the sword and the rope, surrounded by fires. And you thought, Fire Lotus, it'll be great for the city practitioners. And the Sangha came in and was like, that's what we're in the midst of all the time. Would you bring it down a little bit? I think of the Faith Mind, my favorite line in the Faith Mind, which is a poem, well-known poem in the Zen tradition. It says, when the mind exists undisturbed in the way, then things in the world no longer offend. And when things cease to offend, they don't exist in the same way. They still exist, but not in the same way. So when the mind exists undisturbed, and then there again, as we can misunderstand emptiness, we can misunderstand being undisturbed. And we can translate that as a kind of imposition of an idea of equanimity, of calmness, right? Which is not authentic, unless it's authentic. And so this mind that is undisturbed is really the reclaiming, the return to our natural mind. Right? It's not a mind that we create. It's not a mind that we produce. It's not a mind that can destroy. I came across another poem by another master who says something very similar. He says, when a transgression, that which is disturbing me, is transformed into the host, then it no longer disturbs. So what does that mean? When the disturbance, which is here, is transformed into the host, right? Where that duality, that separation dissolves, the disturbance dissolves. So then finally Manjushri says, what is the great compassion of the Bodhisattva? And Vimalakirti says, it's giving all of your accumulated virtues to others. That's why Avalokiteshvara has so many hands, right, with all those implements. So that she can be engaged in so many different ways, and with all of those hands and eyes, she should be generating what is good, what is liberating, what is not harming. And that's her offering. And so that's why as practitioners, it's important to develop ourselves in whatever our Buddha field is. In the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Buddha talks about a Buddha field, which is the field in which you mingle with other beings. And in mingling with other beings, we have the opportunity to serve, to help, and to be helped in turn. And so that's the field in which we're giving away all that we're developing. And that's why it's important, if we develop skills or ways of interacting, things that we can actually offer on any level, then that just increases our ability to have different ways, more ways of giving. Manjushri says, what is the great joy of the Bodhisattva? And Vimalakirti said, it is to be joyful and without regret in giving. And whenever I see regret coming up in the teachings, I always stop and pay attention. Because regret is such a heavy burden to carry. You know, we are so resilient, we are so built to face challenges. We've been doing it as long as we've been on this earth. But regret, you know, so we can fail. We've all, I'm imagining, have failed at certain things in our lives. Nobody's life turns out the way they thought. We can manage that, but regret is a very difficult, deeply inner burden. And so he says to be joyful and without regret in giving, which of course also speaks to not being miserly, being generous. But that what he's pointing to here is that the path of the Bodhisattva is joyful. And I think this is one of the really surprising things, you know, particularly when we're really engaged in things that are difficult. That when we contemplate them by ourselves or reflect on them or chew on them or get entangled in them or have what Wendell Berry called the ain't it awful conversation. You know, where we all sit around and nod our heads and say, ain't it awful? Right? And we're all in perfect agreement and nothing happens. But that when we actually come together as a Sangha, there's joy. Years ago, when I was at the temple full time and was wanting to really get engaged in some sort of earth-based advocacy. And I had several students come and talk about their despair and their despondency, their anger, and after every conversation I thought, that is so much energy that is not being well used. Let's use it, let's put it to use. And so I thought, let's get together. Because when we get together, there is joy. And so that was the beginning of what we call the Earth Initiative. What is the equanimity of the Bodhisattva? Manjushri says, and Vimalakirti says, it is what benefits self and other. That is our equanimity. And then he says, Manjushri, to what should one resort when terrified by life? Here it is again. What do we do when we are terrified by life? Where do we take refuge? And Vimalakirti says, and you know, to think of all the ways that this could be responded to. Vimalakirti says, a bodhisattva who is terrified by life should take refuge in the magnanimity of the Buddha. I wasn't expecting that. In the magnanimity of the Buddha. That the Buddha is magnanimous, Buddha nature, right? Awakened nature. That when we practice and realize our self-nature, we are releasing ourselves from all of those dampening, constricting elements that constrict our basic magnanimity, our magnanimous, generous, joyful nature. And then he says, where should one stand to take refuge in the magnanimity of the Buddha? From what place do I do that? And Vimalakirti says, from the position of baselessness. And Manjushri says, what's the root of baselessness? Where does that come from? And Vimalakirti says, it has no root. Thus, it is baseless. And all things arise from this. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. And so the last of the 5 ranks is unity attained. So there's merging, the 2 blades crossing points, merging of relative and absolute, merging of emptiness and the world, merging of inner and outer, stillness and activity. But the last, but that's not yet. And so Tongshan teaches unity attained, where even the sense of two blades crossing drops away, where even the sense of duality drops away. And of course, this is a fully realized, fully embodied perspective, but what it's pointing to is that is within the capacity of our mind and consciousness. And the poem to that says, everyone wants to leave the current of ordinary life, right? Everybody wants to go to the mountain, to the cave, to the meditation cushion, to the place that is not this, to escape. And he says, but this bodhisattva, after all, comes back and sits amidst the coals and the ashes, returns, never left. I was just reading Nagarjuna, a text by Nagarjuna on the bodhisattva, and he said, having realized freedom from entanglements, you will need to go back in and pick up entanglements. Having realized selflessness, you will need to step back in to the world of form, right, and get mixed up in that again. But now to do that, and at every step along the way, to do that more and more knowingly. And so I think I'd like to just stop there and and open it up and see if there are questions or comments. So the question is, what does this all mean? And what use is it?
Thank you so much for such a...
Could you stand up, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a thorough articulation. One of my, I think, current conundrum is that these wonderful teachings historically have always been held in community, particularly monastic communities who have renounced their worldly affairs, as the saying goes. And in our current context, many of us are pursuing these teachings and practices, many of us on a solo endeavor, or more like drop-in sangha. We come in, we sit, we leave. Or we sit for 7 days, 5 days, 3 days, and then we go back to the whatever life, different expressions of life. So I'm wondering if you can talk about orientation to what you've been referring to as collective karma and working with the collective or collaborative karma through these teachings.
Okay. I'm hearing those, and it may be I'm not just fully hearing your question as you mean it, but I'm hearing those as two slightly different things. One is, the reality of practice in Buddha Dharma today in, let's call it the West, which is evolving as it always has, but because of the time we live in, things change quickly. And so there are solitary practitioners, as you speak of, and there always have been. And solitary practice is actually a very important thing. Even for people who live within communities, monastics, such as myself, solitary practice is very important Because there's something that happens when we're physically alone that is not like other times. You know, we experience, because we are physical beings, I think we experience ourselves in our practice in a particular way. And so one of the things we offer is hermitages, usually for people within our Sangha that we know, because we cut them loose on the mountain for a week and we have to trust that they're okay and that because they're on their own. But and that's a very old tradition of hermit practice. And then there's practicing with others, Sangha. And I really see those as being so essential in the best of worlds, you know, when it's possible. And you know, practicing with others might be a small others, but that we have the opportunity to practice with others. And so what that means for different people is going to be different. And I think, you know, as practitioners, what we can do is do the best we can with the situation we have. If we can improve it or make it more conducive, why not? Make it easier for ourselves. But at every point along the way, be accepting what we do have, and so that we're not diminishing that in our mind and making it as something that in some way inhibits or keeps us from doing what we could actually do if we fully empowered our ability to practice on our own. I was speaking recently with a teacher in another lineage who's also a sociologist, and she was talking, so she teaches a lot of college students, and she was just talking about, you know, the change in practitioners that she's seen in each generation and class of students, I guess. And she said, she thinks Sangha is going to be different. That community practice, the way I grew up in it, the way she grew up in it, where people come in and they're all in and they really dedicate themselves for, you know, sustained periods of time, oftentimes when we were young, you know, and then, you know, go on and, you know, build our lives. She was seeing that as changing. And I said, what do you think that means? And she goes, I don't know, but I wanted to research it. And so I just thought that was interesting, you know, and I think we're seeing, and I'm sure many of you are seeing it much more than I am, because, you know, I am in a monastery, and so I'm a little bit more apart from that, but seeing the evolution, all the different ways that this is evolving. And I think that tension, you know, again, that tension between the solitary and the community, between that deep inner work, which really does take periods of sustained effort. I mean, as far as I know, and it may just be the bias and the limitation of my own experience, although it seems to be borne out in the tradition, that does present us with opportunities that are different than when we get, you know, smaller, concentrated periods of practice. And so there is something about that tradition in so many of the practice-based traditions of Buddhism that emphasizes those periods of more intensive training. And I'm not sure that's going to become any less important. And so that. In terms of the karma, you know, if we think in terms of identities, and in Buddhism generally we think, well, identities are, you know, aspects of the self, and they're reified, and we're trying to, you know, see through and realize that they're empty and that we're not bound by them, and all of that is true. But we have them, right? They are functioning. And the Buddha talked about, you know, there are moments where practicing the self as it arises is how you practice the path towards liberation. So if you're sitting and you're having a very strong self-critical thought, and you think, well, this is empty, so I'm just going to like push this aside because it has no inherent existence. That's not actually going to help you, right? That's going to bind you, and it actually strengthens that very sense of self and that identity, because otherwise, why would we need to suppress it if we didn't believe in itself, and if it didn't have that power? And so the Buddha said in that moment, actually, we need to practice that self, acknowledge that sense of self that is arising, and in a sense affirm it so that we can move towards letting it go. And so if we think of these identities as different aspects that are, in a sense, you know, that we are identified as by our society, by our peers, by our groups, and that then we step into and take on. You know, so I'm white, I'm male, I'm grew up in the South, I'm a monk. You know, all of these different ways we characterize ourselves. Those perceptions themselves are not so much the issue, it's what they mean. Right? So our mind recognizes differences, but society tells us what those differences mean. I mean, that's just a basic understanding of the world and also oppression. Because it's meaning, it's in the meaning of things that we get stuck. When I think of the Buddha in the foundations of mindfulness, mindfulness of the breath, experience the breath in and of itself. One aspect of what that means is it doesn't mean anything. Don't give it any meaning. If it's a short breath, it's just short. If it's a long breath, it's just long. It doesn't mean anything about you. In other words, don't entangle in that. But this sense of collaborative karma is where these different aspects of how we identify ourselves and others identify us in this ongoing process, which is being affirmed all the time, at every moment, becomes my consciousness. Becomes my thoughts, my intentions, my desires, my views, my way of seeing myself, my way of seeing you. And so that's what we need to examine. That's why I feel like this work, I mean, this is a lot of what Greg and I have spoken about, is why, because when we first started doing what in our sangha we call Beyond Fear of Difference, is really looking at the oppression of race and gender and other forms of bias, it was more something that some of the sangha was doing, you know, sort of kind of like a program we were doing to cultivate this and try and bring this forward. And it's really going through a lot of shifts in our own sangha where it is our training, it is Dharma practice, it is something that all students are being asked to engage. Because first of all, what I say to the sangha is, I think if we don't do this, we will make ourselves irrelevant to the world, but also to ourselves. That I think we will not be practicing the Dharma in the way that our time is not just mandating that we do, but is actually giving us the opportunity to, because of our time. And to see the understanding of self and consciousness and all of the Buddhist teachings as being perfectly expressing these aspects of oppression and systemic self. You know, so we can think of this body and mind as a self, but there's a self in a family, in a sangha, in an institution, in a government. And so to examine, to begin to look at how this mind is being created, and for what purpose? Right? Because the purpose of the self is to affirm the self. Right? That's why we move towards what affirms our sense of who we are, and we move away from what threatens our sense of who we are. We like one, we don't like the other. And so that we can see the same thing happening in different bodies. The same kind of reactivity. Right? And so, I don't know if this is answering your question. I'm going off a little bit on a bender. Is that okay? All right.
Hello. I was struck, as somebody coming from another tradition, when you did mention selfless love and the Robert Thurman translation that had been, and of course, in my tradition, we have self-giving love, agape. How would you, when it's selfless love, what self is being spoken of? And you've been speaking in...
When it is selfless love?
You were mentioning it earlier.
And then your question is, what is the self that...
What is the selfless, in that sense of selfless love? We often think of selfless giving as not thinking of oneself, but of, letting, but I'm wondering if you're also thinking of a different sense of no self,
Well,
a
that's,
selfless.
well, I think what you're describing is certainly part of it. In a sense, it's the practice of it, because going back to what I was saying before about at every step along the way, we can think of practice as cultivating wisdom and compassion and all of these different qualities of enlightened being, which is basically our nature. And so how do we practice selflessness or selfless giving when we're still very much embedded in an attachment to our sense of self? Well, so there's a precept on not being stingy, right? Recognizing that at any moment we have something that we could offer somebody that would be helpful. And so to not cultivate that stinginess, which is a self-serving grasping, which is suffering. And then so the other side of that is to be generous. And so we can practice in the moment when the self is very much present and it feels very solid. We can practice selflessness before realizing it by being generous. I mean, that's the power of practice, is that we don't have to, in fact, cannot wait until something is perfectly realized or embodied. Because the way that comes forth is by every step along the way. And so any act of selflessness, of giving without concern or seeking reward or recognition, really just out of concern for the other, is an expression of that selflessness. I mean, people do it all the time. Buddhism ultimately is not about Buddhism. It has no proprietary position, because it's really just the Buddha. I think of the Buddha as somebody who took a voyage deep within and then came back and reported on what he had experienced. So in that sense, anyone who goes in will discover the same things, which is why we find similar themes within many of the great traditions, at the same time that they might be based on some reasonable differences. And so that selflessness is really any expression, any action in which where our attention is larger, right? We're putting somebody else forward before ourselves. Now, sometimes for someone whose karma and who has in their life been cultivated to put themselves last always, right? As they haven't, there's been little generosity bestowed to them. Sometimes selflessness in that way begins with giving to oneself. Because that has to be established. First, in a sense, we have to have, we can't let go of something until we, in a sense, we have it in our hand. And so if we're rejecting something, not out of letting go, but out of rejection, then we can't let go of that. But rejection will look like letting go in our mind. And that's where the Dharma can be dangerous, because it can continue to perpetuate a negative karmic cycle while we think that we're practicing sincerely. I mean, the person's really genuinely trying to do the right thing, but their understanding of letting go is already so established in a kind of self-rejection. And so that needs a different kind of practice, which is more of an affirming of oneself, and really bringing that in, and then to begin to work towards letting that go. And that can be true whether, that's to the degree that that's coming from within and to the degree that that's coming from without. That others, we have been rejected by others. It's not easy practice.
Sorry. Thank you for that last sharing. I really got a lot out of that. I was wondering, sort of moving back to the first question that was asked, I was thinking specifically about monastic living. And I feel that humans are naturally drawn toward discipline and rhythm and practice, and commitment and group community. So why choose monastic life, is my question.
You mean because they will be drawn to those things anyway, outside of a monastic life, so why go to a monastery?
Yeah, I think that a lot of forms of life could be considered monastic or equated to monastic living, but taking different forms from what a lot of people describe as monastic living.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, at our monastery, you know, a lot of people come through because we run different programs, and so I talk to people somewhat regularly who will share that they feel drawn to the monastic life. And usually, because of choices they've made in their life, that's not available to them, or they don't really want to do it, but there are ways in which they're drawn to it. And so what I often encourage them to do is to reflect on what is it about the monastic life that they are drawn to, and can they cultivate some of those elements in their life that they have. You know, in other words, kind of akin to what you're saying, that it's not trying to, you know, directly translate a monastic life to a lay life, but it's what are those elements that would be helpful in your life. So you spoke about, you know, commitment and discipline and so on. And so whatever that means to you and how does that serve you could be a way of cultivating some of those same elements that might very well be part of a monastic life. My own sense, in answer to your question, is that my own experience, and by the way, I had a plan years ago. This wasn't my plan. So living within a community of people was probably one of the last things I thought I would be doing, frankly. I mean, not because I didn't like people, because I was more of a solitary sort of traveler. The things that I like to do were more sort of solitary by nature, and so living within a community of people was just something I never really planned on. But I came to realize it was so much of what I needed and actually wanted without knowing. And so I think on one level, it's just speaking to this very deep, ancient part of us, which is we're social creatures, you know, and we've actually lived in community, and many people still do. We've just ruined so many of our natural communities, you know. And so I think in that way, it's a very natural way to live. But for a practicing community, to be together and to be, you know, to have so many examples around oneself. Brand new students, people who've been practicing longer than we have, is inspiring. And one of the things about spiritual practice, wherever we are, is that it's repetitive. And it needs to be, right? Whatever the core practices are, we need to go back to them again and again and again and again. I mean, it's like a relationship. You have to keep being in relationship, right? Otherwise you don't have one. And that's how it becomes deep and how it really opens up into what it can actually be. And so, but how do we live within that kind of repetitive life without it becoming repetitive? Right? Because that's what happens. Our mind starts to get a little dull when we, you know, like the first bite you take is, you know, full flavor. By the end of the meal, it feels dull, tastes dull, right? And so that too is, I think, where part of the community life is we're continually helping each other. And there's a lot just to the life itself, which is intended to keep your juices flowing. So, I mean, I think on a lot of levels. Now, obviously, it's not for most people. It's also, you could say, it's a kind of lifestyle. I mean, everybody has a lifestyle. And so it's a lifestyle that is based in simplicity, is based in service, is based in selflessness, is based in renunciation, you know, freely giving up. And so it's, you know, it's a choice about how one wants to live. And, you know, one of the things my teacher always looked for in people who are in discernment is, were they thriving? You know, was it making them joyful? That's what he wanted to see. Because if it wasn't, then he wasn't sure it was their life.
Roshi, you spoke about the danger of using emptiness as a way to avoid your life or avoid the world, avoid action. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with someone some years ago who basically said something like that. He said, if we destroy ourselves off the face of the planet, it's just the way of things. Things change and the earth will renew itself and it'll be fine. So how would you respond to that?
I don't know. I wonder if they have anyone they love. There was we have a song in New Zealand, and many years ago, a young fella came, all fired up, to stay as long as it took. Sometimes people show up, how long do I say? As long as it takes. Already this is not going to go well. I mean, usually it's not years or months, it's like hours. And he was a little bit like this. So he came and left pretty quickly and headed back to New Zealand. And somebody told me, one of our song members told me that he was giving a talk on Zen, and he put his watch down on a table and said, "This watch is empty. It has no existence. It doesn't matter," and so on and so on. And I said, "You should have just picked up the watch and walked out the door." It was empty, then he doesn't need it, right? So I don't know what to make of that, really. I don't know what is happening in a person's mind, but to me it just smells like fear, and just a response to fear, to insecurity, to all the normal stuff. And then it's just a particular strategy, right, to not have to deal with it. And I feel like we can't indulge our indulgences anymore, and that doesn't mean we won't, it doesn't mean people won't, but I think what I try and do is find out in a conversation like this, that are we having a conversation, right? Is this actually a dialogue? In other words, is there any openness? Is there a question in that? Because if there's not, then there may not be much point to having a conversation.
Well, so I was thinking also of the question that was asked earlier. So in the monastic life, there's all these checks, in a sense. If you want to sit too long instead of going to talk to someone, somebody will ask you to do otherwise. And so there's ways in which you're constantly being asked to turn toward rather than away from. But if you are here, out here in the world, it's up to you. And so...
well, but you're being, like yesterday Roshi said, we need to test our practice and our understanding against the teachings. So we have to trust ourselves. But so how do we know if we're on track or not? So we keep going back to the teachings. Is what I'm doing, is what I'm experiencing in alignment with what the teachings are saying? And he said, but then we also have to test it in life. We have to be tested, and just test ourselves in life. In other words, because it's easy to decide within ourselves the way things are, or the way we are. But life will undo that very quickly. And so, maybe because of where I live, I don't meet a lot of people who, adopt that kind of attitude. But I think that sooner or later, that's going to meet truth, right? In a way that will be very difficult to sort of maintain that wall, right? In other words, when it really matters, when somebody really gets, their life falls apart, or something they really care about gets destroyed, is that going to help that person? Right? And so I think sometimes it just takes time. It's like, what brings forth bodhicitta? Right? Given all the differences in our lives and, why? And so I think the ways in which that arises for people, and doesn't, is part of our own, the life that we're working out. but it's painful. I mean, it hurts me, you know, when to see, you know, the Dharma misused, you know, when teachers act out, that hurt. I feel hurt. I feel because it hurts all of us, you know. And it hurts us as Buddhists. I think it hurts all people who care about, you know, this, right? Because it's not a good example, right? And we need good examples. And because of that, I think we're in a time that is precipitous in its inclination towards cynicism and skepticism and apathy and indifference, and for lots of, you know, understandable reasons. I mean, when we face things that are so, I mean, are our minds large enough to hold the world as it is today? You know, were our minds built to hold all the information that we're getting? We're finding out, you know, but it's a crash course. And so I think that because we've seen so much, you know, I say negative examples, but at the same time, a lot of what's of that which we're seeing is also helping to precipitate change. Right? Black Lives Matter, Me Too, our president is helping to precipitate change in different directions, yes. But I mean, I think that's one thing about the Bodhisattva view and the path is it's not that everything's unpredictable, but we don't actually know what happens next. You know? And so to continually be practicing, I think that's why intention in Buddhism is so important. You know, that when we understand the power of intention, and that alone is not enough. We need skillfulness, we need wisdom, but at the same time to not, you know, to want to be affecting change, real change in real ways, but at the same time to not get stifled by, you know, results. And that balance, I think, is very delicate, but maybe necessary.
I'm thinking of a very practical situation, which was a recent one in which I participated for the first time in an extinction rebellion and a mobilization. I did that because I know one of the monks who's part of the organization, and he said, I'm wanting this all to be based in love. And I felt it was, but I'm interested in just what happens when things are so wildly unpredictable. I felt very afraid with the police and sirens and much activity, but I felt very present, as though the practice really helped me. And then I thought, well, what seems to work best is when I talk to other people who ask me what we're doing. And that seemed to give me more of a sense of purpose. But I felt the sort of the edge of moving from solid community and staying with our breath to different motivations creeping in. So I'm just curious, since this is called social action and that's part of the talk, if you could address these processes. I felt the people I was with were holding the energy well, but I feel scared almost to go to another one.
Well, I think, you know, to enter into that field is to enter into that uncertainty. Because I think by its nature, you know, one cannot know everyone that's there and every motive and how that's going to play out. And so I think that's part of the aliveness and wildness, you know, relative wildness that might be part of civil disobedience. And that has, I think, its role. I mean, I think that has its purpose. And in the work that we've done in our ground fear of differences, and for some in the Earth Initiative, some of these different projects, these things that we're doing within our own saga, for some people we're not doing nearly enough, and for others we're doing way too much. And what I have said all along is I want everybody to come along, right? That's my intention, is try and bring everybody along, and that what we're doing have substance and be real, and that as many people as possible can find themselves a place in that. Because in any action, there are lots of places that need to be taken. And people have different temperaments and inclinations and so on. And so I think, at once both being able to challenge ourselves and step forward and engage in a way that we may not have before. And at the same time to do what we can do so that we keep doing. Because I think sustaining, it's so much like Dharma practice. Anybody can sit for a minute. Anybody can do a retreat. But to live a life of Dharma, that's another thing. Because everybody gets lost. Getting lost is easy. And there's so many ways to get lost. Finding our way back, that takes skill. Staying on the path, that takes skill. And more than skill, it takes the whole thing. And so if we're in this for, again, that's why I think path is such an important, not just an image or a metaphor, but a reality. That this is living. Dharma practice is life. It's the same thing. And yes, it requires certain things, right? And if to have depth, it requires, depending on one's tradition and practice base and so on, it requires practicing, whatever that means, within one's particular tradition. But it means doing, it means time and energy and so on, and that can also bring us into tension with the time and energy that our life and being socially active requires. And again, people are going to find their places in different roles along it. Some people are going to do it as their whole calling, and other people are going to do it differently.
So in a way, I feel like you've already answered my question, but on the other side of the coin of what Zuise was saying, in that there's people with complete apathy. A lot of us are going to walk out here today into post-Thanksgiving New York City with all its colors and lights and distractions and people shopping themselves into debt and kind of perpetuating a very materialistic version of delusion. And we're going to go out into the theater of this oppressive, capitalist, imperialist system. And as Dharma practitioners, we can say, my job is to practice that skill, stay on the path, bring myself back when I get lost. Practice as a lotus in the fire, but sometimes the fire is really hot. And do we just get out of the kitchen? It doesn't. You said before, when blade meets blade, don't withdraw. Become the master of that sword. And it's easy to say, just practice at every step. That it's moment by moment practice, and you have to let go of the results. You can't. New York City and the machine and what it stands for is not just going to disappear in a snap.
I would suggest, seeing the whole, that all of those things as you were describing them, there is beauty and joy and relationship and life in all of those things. And that we need to see those too, you know. That we can become myopic in any direction. You know? In other words, our vision can be too narrow in any direction if we only look in one direction. And so I think how do you sustain, nourish, replenish, joyfulize yourself? In other words, how do we see if we're looking into the belly, how do we also see the head and the horn and the, you know, glossy coat? You know, in other words, the whole. Because there's that too. You know, that at the same time there is all that you described, there are miracles every day, everywhere. And most people, I think, are trying to live good lives most of the time. We don't always succeed. And we may be doing that within a solid state of ignorance, right? In which that good life is causing a lot of harm, knowingly or unknowingly.
But if it made Villa McCurdy sick, what chance do we stand?
I'll say that again.
If it made Villa McCurdy sick, what chance do we stand?
If it made who sick?
Villa McCurdy?
Bill McCurdy.
Villa McCurdy.
Oh, Bill McCurdy. Bill McCurdy built my mother's home. Does he sick? He lives in North Carolina. That's how precarious it is. So now ask your question.
So if it made Villa McCurdy sick, what chance?
Sick. Yes.
What chance do we stand?
Well, a great chance, because he was in full ownership of his sickness. Right? He was sick so that we would come here tonight and have this conversation. He was putting his sickness in service to us. You've been raising your hand. We'll end with this.
In talking about the development of compassion, I was listening to you, I was wondering if the development of compassion is really perhaps a byproduct of the internal struggle that people go through. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, how do you mean that? I mean, what do you mean, byproduct of the internal struggle?
So, if you are a person who has struggled and have come out, are you more likely to be a compassionate person towards other people? And I'm talking about not seeking to grow compassion, like feeding plants with your miracle growth. I'm not sure that that's the way to get at compassion.
Well, but I think, why do we struggle? You know, why do we just want to alleviate suffering? Is that enough? Do we just want to live in a world without suffering? I don't think so. I think we want to alleviate suffering so that we can live in a joy of in a world of compassion and loving kindness and patience and generosity. That's what we want. And so I think when we are struggling to you know, shift something, you know, or release ourselves from something, that's not just because we want to be free of this, it's because we want something affirming, positive, you know, beneficial. And so I think that is, I mean, Buddhism believes that because, you know, our basic structure is to gravitate towards what is affirmative of life, described as pleasure, and moves away from what is destructive of life, pain, that's our fundamental impulse. That's what we want. And we want that, in fact, for everyone. And that just gets distorted and twisted and turned around because of the whole catastrophe. But that ultimately, that's really what we're seeking. That's why these qualities that these teachings speak about, I think, speak to us because they already reside within us. I mean, nothing that comes out of practice is new in that sense. Nothing is coming from the outside. It's all being brought forth from within us, even if we feel like, I don't have any of that. It's there. And so that's really the whole of Buddhist practice is not, we use the word cultivation because it's easy to understand and there's a sense in which that seems to be happening, but really it's just, as Vimalakirti said, just stop producing. Stop creating that which is binding us, and then we're not bound. It's not stop creating that which suppresses our compassion, and then that compassion comes forth. But I do feel that, the sense that if I just practice and enlighten my mind, that then I will be spontaneously compassionate. I don't believe that. I believe that, yes, that will be cultivating coming forth, because it has to be, in order for us to be, developing on the path. But that's why there are all these sort of meta practices and generative practices in Buddhism to bring forth compassion. That we're not just waiting for wisdom to release it, but we're actually actively engaged in bringing it forth because it's here. It's here. Okay, so we've come to our time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Greg and Peace, for the invitation.
And thank you all for being here as well.